Hello everyone. For my presentation, I will be talking about violence among children in Colombia and Mexico. In the fictional works of Our Lady of the Assassins by Fernando Vallejo and Down the Rabbit Hole by Juan Pablo Villalobos. First begin with a question. Why do Alexis, Wilmer, and Tokley all try so hard to be confident and macho, like the adults around them? Throughout the two stories, the characters assume awfully unusual attitudes when it comes to violence, particularly considering how old they are. However, they likely pick these views up from the adults around them, and I will explain why. My thesis for this presentation is that in the books Our Lady of the Assassins and Down the Rabbit Hole, a dangerous environment and involvement in a criminal culture forces Alexis, Wilmer, and Tokley to grow up quickly and to assume roles as confident adults in order to feel a desperately needed sense of security. Now, before I make my argument, we must establish a foundation. We must answer a different question. This one being, does exposure to violence in childhood really make you grow up faster? And luckily, there is a 2009 study by Monica Kirkpatrick Johnson and Stephanie Malborn published in Social Psychology Quarterly, and it looked at just that. They found that hardship in several domains during childhood and adolescence is associated with feeling relatively older and self-identifying as an adult in the late teens and 20s, as well as specifically young people who, as adults, felt unsafe in their schools or neighborhoods, witnessed or were victims of violence, had fewer economic resources in the household, and lived in certain family structures, reported older subjective ages. Finally, entering adult roles earlier mediates, or at least partially mediates, many of these relationships. That is a very important finding, as Alexis, Wilmer, and Tokley all enter adult roles to some extent through the violent behavior they are involved in or exposed to, which leads to their early maturity. They mimic the behavior of the adults around them in order to cope. So, now that we have evidence that exposure to violence in childhood really can make you grow up faster, I will continue to build my argument by showing you exactly how the research findings apply to the children in the two stories. Sicarios as teens. In Our Lady of the Assassins, Alexis and Wilmer are direct participants in violence and even have killed seemingly on a whim. As we have learned, a sicario is a kind of hitman and or bodyguard, literally translating to assassin. In the case of both Alexis and Wilmer, they were also, to some extent, participating in romantic relations with Fernando. The extent of their relationship is unclear, but it could likely be considered a form of prostitution, or at least a coerced relationship, and one potentially with a minor at that. But how did Alexis and Wilmer end up as sicarios in the first place? In Our Lady of the Assassins, it is not unheard of for young adults, teens, and even preteens, particularly from poor families, to become sicarios in Medellin, Colombia. On page 4, the narrator, Fernando, explicitly states this. Here, the hitmen are kids or young guys, 12, 15, 17 years old, like Alexis. On the prior page, he gives this explanation as background to Alexis. Alexis, yeah, that's what he calls himself. The name is nice, but I didn't give him it. His ma did. According to the habit poor people have of giving names of rich, extravagant foreign types. This adds another element to Alexis's need to mature quickly. He must provide for his family in any way he can. Providing for his family is clearly an adult role, and so that responsibility placed on Alexis further pressures him to mature. And then, Wilmer. Fernando meets Wilmer by sheer chance in part 3 after Alexis dies. I asked him where he was going, and he replied nowhere in particular. I asked the young guy if he'd had lunch. He replied yes, the day before yesterday. So I invited the ascetic to lunch. Obviously, Wilmer doesn't have a job or any money. We know that Wilmer is destined to be Fernando's new Sicario from the start, as it is revealed when they return to Fernando's room that he carries a revolver and is willing to participate in the same kind of relationship that Alexis did. Now, we move on to Tokley. On page 3, Tokley, the narrator, introduces himself with the following. Some people say I'm precocious. They say it mainly because they think I know difficult words for a little boy. Some of the words I know are sordid, disastrous, immaculate, pathetic, and devastating. The fact that people think Tokley is precocious demonstrates, at least to an extent, that he is more mature than what is typical for his age. Also, take note of the difficult words he uses. Sordid, disastrous, immaculate, pathetic, and devastating. The theme could not be more obvious. He only knows these words so that he can talk about the sordid and disastrous things their gang inflicted on their foes, how devastating the whole thing was to their pathetic enemy, and how immaculate their palace he lives in is. Tokley isn't some child genius that has an advanced vocabulary. He just picks up words from the environment he is raised in. On the next page, Tokley tells us even more about his attitudes. What I definitely am is macho. For example, I don't cry all the time because I don't have a mom. If you don't have a mom, you're supposed to cry a lot, gallons of tears, 2 or 3 gallons a day. But I don't cry because people who cry are faggots. When I'm sad, Yelka tells me not to cry. He says, "Chin up, Tokley, take it like a man." But, as we soon learn, Tokley isn't as macho as he thinks. When going to the doctor for his stomach pains, the doctor tells him, he tells us, according to the doctor, there was something wrong with my psychology, not my tummy. Stomach aches have long been associated with nervousness, anxiety, stress, or any other fear-related emotion, really. Why would someone as macho as Tokley says he is have so much anxiety? Finally, when it comes to euthanize his sick, beloved pygmy hippopotami, the suppressed emotion building in Tokley finally comes out all at once. It turned out I'm not macho after all, and I started to cry like a faggot. I also wet my pants. Tokley's anxiety about guilt have finally clearly revealed themselves. The only reason it is hidden earlier in the book is because Tokley puts on this act of false maturity and manliness. The act is exactly what the researchers in the article I referenced earlier had concluded. In order to adapt to the violence and hardship in their surroundings, the children develop a sense of maturity and responsibility. Conclusion. The two stories have very different settings and very different narrators. Tokely is, by many standards, a rather spoiled but otherwise innocent child who happened to be born into a cartel. He refers to his house as a palace, has a personal tutor, owns a massive collection of hats, and goes on a trip to Liberia to catch a pygmy hippopotamus not long after he decides he wants one. He puts on his tough guy act to cope, but when it comes down to it, he really isn't macho like he brags he is. His guilt and anxiety give him terrible stomach aches, and he wets his pants when they have to euthanize his hippos. Alexis and Wilmer, on the other hand, are much more cold when it comes to the killing. Most of the time, they don't hesitate. They have a job to do, and they're going to do it well. They don't have the luxury to not do a good job, as they are working in order to try to escape poverty. They likely feel the need to oblige with whatever sexual favors Fernando requested them, as they can't risk losing his favor. Circumstances may be different, but the overall effect is the same. Violence and fear have led all three children to mature more quickly than they should, an effect that cannot be reversed. That ends my presentation. Here's my works cited.